Good morning and good afternoon. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We are delighted to have you with us today for an extraordinary event on Mr. Navalny, Mr. Putin, and the future of Russia. We have with us today a wonderful cast to discuss this. We have two leaders of the opposition activists in Russia, Vladimir Milov and Vladimir Kara Murza, who are well known, I believe, to my audience. We have Anders Osland, a world-known economist, great expert on Russia in the post-Soviet space, or Eurasia, I should say. And we have Maria Snegovaya, also a noted scholar on Russia and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Mr. Navalny has simply rocked Russia over the past 8 or 9 months. The challenge he poses for the Kremlin is such they tried to poison him last summer. After he recovered in Germany, he tricked one of the FSB operatives who tried to kill him to describe how the operation went. He then returned to Russia and was arrested. While in jail, he issued a video on Putin's palace on the warm seas to the south of Russia and launched massive demonstrations across the length and breadth of Russia. A truly extraordinary series of events, which we'll discuss with you this morning and this afternoon. I'll like to start with Vlad Milov, who works closely with Mr. Navalny. Vlad, why did Navalny return to Russia? Does he believe that he cannot be effective operating outside of Russia?
Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure and honor to be here as always. Alexei Navalny never had any doubt. I mean, there was a lot of expert and commentator discussions about whether he will return or not return to Russia. But as a matter of fact, he never had any doubt about his return as soon as he physically recovers and is able to do so. As he noted many times, he did not leave Russia by his own will. He was essentially brought unconscious to Germany, and obviously he was anxious to return to this great network of resistance that he has built over years, and which Putin, as we can see right now, fears so deeply that he's trying to put like everybody in jail to prevent us from getting people onto the streets and participating in a campaign against his party at the elections. So Navalny understands his sense of purpose and his historical mission. And actually, this is what he has been all about. His activity has been all about in the past more than a decade. So why he would give up now? It was never a question that he would stay. It's not an issue of effectiveness. And also, I think many people are wrong who try to analyze his behavior in terms of, is he afraid or not? He's a very experienced person. He spent almost a year in jail under various sequences of administrative arrests. He spent a year at home under home arrest. His brother spent years in jail, being convicted under the same Eurasia case in connection to which Navalny is jail right now. So he knows how's that being under arrest. He's definitely not afraid of that. And I also can say that, to my understanding, he's extremely angry at Putin for trying to kill him. He wants to deliver an answer and deliver it swiftly and strongly. So this is why he came as soon as it was possible, because of his recovery, and there was never in question.
Thank you. Vlad Kara Murza, Anders and I are old enough to remember Solzhenitsyn and how the Russians decided to deal with him by exiling him in 1974, I think it was. Why did the Kremlin choose to arrest Navalny, allow him in and arrest him, rather than simply prevent his entry into the country?
Good morning, Ambassador Herbst, and thank you to you and to the Atlantic Council for hosting our conversation. I want to first just touch on the point that Vladimir Milov was just making.
Okay,
there was never any doubt for a second that Alexei would return. I remember when he woke out of the coma back in September at the Berlin Charité Clinic, and one of the first things he said was that he will be going back to Russia. And I was, literally inundated with calls from mostly Western journalists asking me to comment on this sensation, as they put it, that he was going back, to which I said that not only don't I see any kind of sensation, I do not see any news in this at all. Of course he's going to go back. That's the only decision he can make. A Russian politician has to be in Russia. It cannot be any other way. I remember very well that after both of my poisonings, there was never any doubt in my mind that I'll go back, and I did as soon as I was physically allowed to fly by the doctors. I think the biggest gift those of us who oppose Putin can give to this regime is if we all just stayed out. And in fact, to go to your question, John, back since the Soviet days, the authorities have determined that the most successful way for them to fight their opponents, to fight political dissidents, was not to arrest them, was not to jail them, was actually to keep them out of the country or to kick them out of the country. You mentioned Solzhenitsyn, of course, there are many, he was the first prominent dissident who was expelled. Of course, there were many others to follow. Vladimir Bukovsky, Alexander Ginsburg, Yuri Orlov, and many, many others too numerous to mention, because they realized that once people are out of the country, not only do they lose the connections, which sort of that aspect is less relevant now with the modern technologies that we have, but most importantly, and that remains unchanged, when you're outside, you lose the moral clout, you lose the moral authority to continue the fight. And the authorities understand that very well. So in fact, their preference was for Alexei to stay outside of Russia. And that is why, of course, while he was in Germany, they made all of these announcements that there's a new criminal case, that his suspended sentence is being transferred into a real prison term, that there's a federal search warrant issued against him, and so on and so forth. They did everything they could while he was out of Russia to make sure that he does not return. But again, that was never going to happen. Alexei Navalny is a Russian opposition politician. In fact, he's now the most prominent political opponent. He's a recognized leader of the Russian opposition. His place is in Russia. It cannot be any other way. And as to your question as to why did they allow him to return, when they couldn't not allow him to return. I mean, how can you not allow a Russian citizen to return to Russia? That's a know-how that's still not available to even the current Kremlin. I mean, we do have that article in the Russian constitution in one of the first two chapters, which cannot be changed and could not be changed by Putin's sham constitutional amendments last year, that nobody can be deprived of their citizenship. That is, in fact, what the Soviets used to do with Solzhenitsyn and with others. It has actually been done once in modern Russian history under Putin. It has, in fact, been done with Vladimir Bukovsky, whom Vladimir Milov and I both had the honor to know. He had his, the authorities refused to extend his passport. I think this was back in 2014 when he wanted to renew his passport to return to Russia. They refused to do this, saying, and this was sort of brilliant anyway. They said, we cannot find any confirmation that you're actually a Russian citizen. Which you think about, that's amazing. They could say this to anybody. You know, what confirmation do we all have except the passport, which they refuse to recognize? But generally speaking, though, that's a tool that's not available to them. So the only thing they could do is to arrest Alexei on his return, which they did. And by the way, less than an hour ago, the Moscow Regional Court upheld the pretrial detention of Alexei into February, and next week, February 2nd, will be the actual court session on his sentencing to transform his conditional sentence into a real-life prison term.
Okay, let me ask a quick question. What do you think the impact was of the Putin Palace video?
Is this for me, John?
Yes.
Oh, I think it was astonishing. I mean, up to just before we began this, I checked the latest view count on YouTube of this video. It's now up to 96 million views. The vast majority of them are within Russia. So most Russian households have now seen this film. That is, of course, an investigative film into Putin's $1.3 billion palace on the Russian Black Sea coast. Some of the best, real estate that Russia has, complete with swimming pools, skating rinks, wineries, spas, and all the rest of it. That's in a country where around 20 million people are hovering around the poverty line, and where 23% of the population lack access to a central sewer system. We have the dictator who has a palace like this. And it's difficult to overestimate, in fact, how much this means. And it's also an important indication of the influence and the appeal that Navalny and his movement have, that the number of views of this film now far, far exceed the combined audiences of state-run television programs.
Okay, Maria, you've done research on Russian youth. How do you gauge the impact of Navalny's expose of the FSB poisoning and also the Putin Palace video, and for that matter, other public activities of his on Russian youth?
Thank you, John, and I'm grateful to the Atlantic Council for hosting the event. In particular, of course, my thoughts and prayers are with Alexei Navalny, Vladimir Milov, and other Russian opposition leaders who are currently being very severely persecuted by the authorities as we speak. To answer your question, John, unfortunately, as of now, I actually reached out to Eurasia Center ahead of this event asking about the polls. They're actually preparing something, and it will be out in a week, perhaps. We don't have the polls yet to be able to really evaluate the effect of the video. However, there's some side indicators that can tell us the sort of effect that the video will have on the minds and views of the Russian population. First of all, as Vladimir Kara Murza said, 98 million views, of them about 70%, based on different estimates, are from Russia. Huge amount, completely unprecedented coverage. I'm pretty sure that we can safely say that most of Russian citizens as of now know about this video, know about this content. Some people try to gauge the interest by asking people on camera, if they saw the video, which they think. And while of course it's nowhere near representative of the Russian population viewpoint, there's however indication that tell us, first of all the younger people who asked, all of them watched the video and all of them say it's Putin's palace. The very interesting reaction comes from the older groups. Typical answer is, no, I don't think it's Putin palace. I don't believe it. But then if it's his, so he earned it. Why are you worried about this? So this is a very typical, quite hypocritical answer that we actually see on many other instances. Like, for example, when asked, did Putin interfere in Ukraine? A question will be, and the response will be very similar. But most importantly, it indicates the ongoing divide within the Russian population. When the younger groups, people below 35, 40, they're increasingly opposition-minded and increasingly side with Alexei Navalny's cause, and older generations are still reluctant to sort of endorse this view, still sort of trying to very hard to preserve their loyalty. And of course, there is also broader polls that shows overall how the Russian population views Putin. And again, the trends over the last year are very, very telling. The Russian youth, again, we're talking here people below 35, are increasingly dissatisfied with the situation in the country and specifically Vladimir Putin personally. This summer, for example, over 2/3 of 18 to 24-year-olds thought that things in Russia were going in the wrong direction, as opposed to 40% on average. Most dramatic finding comes from December 2020 Levada poll that shows that within a year, the share of voters aged 18-24 who are ready to support Putin dropped most radically. It dropped from 36% to 20% of population. This is as opposed to other social groups where these trends either stayed the same or even slightly increased among the older groups. All of that demonstrate that the regime at this point increasingly losing support primarily among the younger generations, those below 35, and the trends are particularly pronounced in the groups 18-24. That, by the way, exactly what we saw on January 23rd, when younger people below 30 showed up in higher numbers. That doesn't mean, I just want to highlight, that Navalny brings schoolboys to the streets. Not true. It means that the younger generation increasingly loses connection to Putin because this regime has nothing to offer to them anymore. Thank you.
Is it also safe to say that maybe one of the reasons why the younger generation has this disconnection from Putin is that they are more likely to use social media and have access to the information from Navalny himself, but also from others?
That's absolutely true. Thank you very much, John. Certainly, that is polarization that is partly the factor of the internet. We see that on all the polls that people who are on the internet, those who are online, they tend to be much more position-minded, and they do tend to support Alexei Navalny. This is the new trend. Like 3 years or 4 years before, there was no such a sharp divide. We didn't see such a sharp difference between people who primarily get their news on internet as opposed to those who get the main news on state TV channels. But I just wanted to highlight that there's still an age difference here that has to do with the fact that younger people, the new generations, they don't see this their future under this regime. They cannot find them within the system that currently exists in Russia. And that, along with being exposed to more information on the internet, that is the factor that drives this frustration.
Thank you. Vladimir Milov, the breadth and the size of the demonstrations against Navalny's arrest are impressive. How long can these demonstrations continue?
We don't know. It's just a field experiment that is being unfolding in front of our eyes. I also have to say that going back to the impact of the Palace movie, which is right now, I think it's even bigger than what Vladimir Kara Murza have said. It's closer to 100 million views now. And as we all know from previous experiences, the real impact might be a delayed one. There might be a lag time needed for people to mobilize. I think what mobilizes people more at this point is exactly this movie, not already the fact that Navalny was poisoned and subsequently arrested upon arrival, because this movie actually destroys one of the most important points of Putin's mythology about himself. Putin always tried to portray himself as an ascetic person who actually works day and night but only serving the country, you know, and he actually did nothing to personally enrich himself. Now we find out that he went beyond all limits in taking care and paying attention to his own personal luxury, and this went off the wall even by Russian oligarchic standards. This is something much bigger and much more obscene than anyone has ever thought. So my understanding is that there might be ups and downs, but in the course of few weeks or months, more and more people, after seeing this, discussing this with their relatives, friends, will be ready to hit the streets. Also in connection with the upcoming parliamentary election campaign, plus the economic situation is not getting any better. So I'd say in a longer run, we're not discussing just this or next week, but in a bit longer run, I see a strong upward trend of numbers of people actually wanting to go out and protest. Also, referring to what Maria have said about the total lack of vision for the future, because Putin is not delivering any. I recall myself when I was 16, 17 in the 80s, we totally hated this perspective of living, under the salary of Soviet engineer, 160 rubles, no opportunity, no entrepreneurship, no travel abroad. Basically, you buy a refrigerator, you buy a TV set, and then you die. That's the prospect. People don't like that. Putin is not giving people, Russian people, any prospect, particularly youth. So I assume that the numbers of people who would be willing to protest, they will significantly increase.
Vlad, Navalny has proved to be a very effective tactician, right? They poison him, then he gets one of the FSB operatives to basically describe it on the phone how it happened. They arrest him, he releases this video, which makes this enormous impact. It seems like he's got a very good organization and an ability to counterpunch when he is hurt. Any comment on this?
Yeah, of course. And this is simply because we all realized, and Navalny himself have realized that, oh yeah, Putin will deliver a response to all our anti-corruption investigations and YouTube television, to all, the crimes and corruption of Putin and his regime that we had exposed. Yes, there will be a response. We obviously expected that, and Navalny was pretty clear about that. Now I think it's time when we would see with all these two different trends, two different forces, they basically have entered the stage of a direct clash. And Navalny's return had accelerated that. We'll see what the outcome will be, but comparing this to what happened months ago in Belarus, I think we are very clear seeing that the only defense Putin has to offer is force. The only instrument with which he's defending his regime is by force. There are no counter protests saying that we're happy with Putin, go away with your anti-corruption movies or investigations. We don't want anything like that. I mean, there are some people in the society who would tell you that, but it can be clearly seen that the erosion of legitimacy is comparable to that we've seen with Lukashenko in the past few months. So the only instrument Putin can use is force. However, in the coming months, we will see the limits of that. We will see how this machine will become day by day exhausted. let's see where it goes. I will not make a lasting forecast, but it's very clear that there are no other tools for Putin to defend himself except the repression and the excessive use of force, which we have been witnessing for the past several days.
Okay, thank you. Vlad Kara Murza, Vladimir Milov makes an important point that it seems that the reaction that Putin is ultimately left with is force. Force also, of course, creates problems for Putin, especially internationally. So in your judgment, does this mean that the use of force by Putin, does this mean that he is increasingly concerned about the challenge and even danger that Navalny represents to his regime?
Well, force is the last thing he has left, as Vladimir exactly said a few seconds ago. I think the key phrase was erosion of legitimacy. Putin realizes that. I mean, as we can debate as to how much legitimacy he ever had, because, you know, the only election that Putin won that could even approach, you know, competitive democratic standards was back in 2000, more than 20 years ago. And that's not me speaking. You can go and look at the observer mission reports by the OSCE and the Council of Europe. That's the last time they assessed the Russian election to be more or less free or fair. We can even debate about that. But there's no debate that since then, we haven't had anything approaching a free and fair election. I mean, we live in the 21st century. The basis for legitimacy of any government is support of its citizens expressed through democratic elections, and we haven't had that in Russia for decades. So, you know, for years the Putin regime has stood on the force of its repression, on the skillfulness of its propaganda, but also, and you know, I hate to say this, but that's just stating the obvious, also on the passive acquiescence of a significant part of the Russian population, and those last two elements are essentially gone. Silence and passive acquiescence are no longer. I have to say, it's very exciting to watch the awakening of society. The propaganda, as we've just been discussing with the investigative movie on Putin's palace. Yes, the propaganda is still there, but its relative effectiveness is much reduced just because of the modern technology and just because of the age we're living in. So yes, force is the only thing that Putin has left. But you know, as Ronald Reagan, I think it was, who once said that regimes planted by bayonets rarely take root. I mean, there's only so much time that you can survive on force alone.
Fair point. Okay. Maria, the Kremlin likes to dismiss Navalny as a Western agent. How does this resonate among the Russian population?
Thank you, John. Yeah, yet again, there's no polls that directly ask this question, but there are some side indicators that we can use to understand what's going on. Because Navalny is commonly presented in the media by the Kremlin as this so-called foreign agent. The foreign agent law it's many years old in Russia at this point. It's been introduced originally against the NGOs. So there is polls that Eurasia Center, which itself was put on the foreign agent list, the Eurasia Center run to understand how Russians treat the foreign agent law. So first of all, very few Russians know about the existence of this law in the first place. About 50% of them have not really heard of them at all. Of those who have heard, in the recent years, the dynamic is actually quite interesting. A decreasing number of people, for example, 56% in 2017, but only 48% in 2021, so almost 10% less. Only 48% think that this law means to protect Russia against the malicious interference of the West. And the growing numbers, for example, by 2021, 30%, that is 1/3 of those who know about the law, they think that this is the law that directed against criticism of the authorities. So in this sense, Russians, or increasing number of Russians, they actually understand that these are not, when you're labeled as a foreign agent or as a Western agent, this is not because you are, but that's because the authorities try to portray you that way. Another question is that bad that for the Russian youth, when Navalny is portrayed as a Western agent? That's also not necessarily the case, because as we show in other polls, in other studies, Russian youth is actually quite pro-Western. So it's not even a given that being portrayed as a Western agent is a bad thing for this group. In fact, one of the reasons why Putin loses touch with this particular part of the population that's also pro-Navalny, as we have discussed before, is because the younger Russians perceive that Putin is taking Russia increasingly away from the West, and that's not a good thing for them because they are much more integrated in the West, into the culture, into the some behavioral patterns. They have many more friends from the West online than older generations do. So in this sense, I do not think that within this particular group, presenting Navalny as a foreign agent will actually achieve the Kremlin's goals. But it's also not a given that the Kremlin wants to achieve the goals specifically within this group. What we see instead is a deepening polarization. As I said before, there's growing groups, particularly among younger Russians, but also spreading into the other groups of the society who are on internet, those who dissociate themselves from the Kremlin increasingly. But there is still a fairly large group, of course, that sides with Putin, the traditional Russia. And of course, within this group, this message and these narratives of Navalny is a Western agent is going to resonate. So in the recent years, we're likely to see this deepening polarization between so-called modernizing parts of the society and its more traditionalist part that still backs Putin.
Thank you. Vladimir Milov, what do you make of the U.S. response thus far to the arrest of Navalny and the crackdown on the demonstrators? The statement by Jake Sullivan last week criticizing the arrest, also the Biden-Putin phone call where Biden apparently mentioned this.
Well, I think it's good to have the responsible government being back on the world stage from Washington, D.C. And we were actually appalled by total lack of reaction from former President Trump on Navalny's poisoning. The only phrase we heard is that we'll have to talk about it at a later time, which never came subsequently. So it's good to know that the U.S. is back supporting and protecting democratic values in the world. However, it is obvious that it is up to us, Russians, to settle the score with Putin and to return Russia to normalcy. But it's also good to have this strong international solidarity in condemning this lawlessness. I would say, I think one word says it all, total lawlessness in which Putin is putting our country at this moment. So it's also very good that the US position resonated with that of Europe. It's very important that the democratic world stands united and maintains a uniform position against all this oppression of people who speak against Putin's regime and violations of the rule of law in Russia that Putin is engaged in. So it's also very important that it's not just, these are not just some statements from high-ranked United States officials, but it's also the voice of the free people, the democratic world, which speaks against what the Putin's dictatorship is doing. So I think it's also very good to know that Biden administration had begun with the vigorous steps to re-engage with its European allies and counterparts. I think it is important if international pressure on Putin will play a significant part in further developments, and it's good that America had started to re-engage with its European allies to see a united democratic world position against the repressions and tyranny by Putin's dictatorship. That's good news.
Okay, thank you. Anders, you and Dan Fried have written a widely read article on the need to levy sanctions and you offered specific suggestions. The EU, as you know, has called for sanctions on Moscow in connection with the poisoning of Navalny. What do you recommend?
Well, first of all, this is one of the first crises that that President Biden is facing. This is a defining moment for him and his foreign policy. He has better put down the foot very firmly. And there are also other reasons for that. It's important to protect Alexei Navalny now. And as Vladimir Milov just mentioned, President Trump couldn't care less about what happened to Alexei Navalny. So the US has some catching up to do. So what Ambassador Dan Fried and I recommend, that is that we should simply follow the list of 8 people to be sanctioned that Alexei Navalny has proposed himself. And in particular, there are 2 of the biggest Russian oligarchs, multi-billionaires, who were not sanctioned previously, who should be sanctioned. The people who are closest to the Kremlin, Roman Abramovich and Alexei Usmanov. Then Navalny also proposes two of the top state bankers. Andrei Kostin is already sanctioned by the US. Igor Shuvalov, the head of Vneshekonom Bank, VB, should also be sanctioned. And then two princelings, sons of the current and former heads of the FSB, who have got very big positions and probably $500 million or so, just because their fathers are among Putin's close friends from St. Petersburg, KGB. So these are people who should be exposed. Also, Vladimir Solovyov, one of the top propagandists. This is not a question of freedom of media or speech. These are information warriors. And the US has already sanctioned Dmitry Kiselyov, one of the top propagandists. Vladimir Solovyov is a good second name. And then Navalny has also proposed the Minister of Healthcare, Mikhail Murashko, who indeed was responsible for him not getting out of hospital and to Germany earlier than was the case. So we think that this is a good list. We think it's important to do what Navalny proposes, and we think it's very important to act fast, because this will define both what the US does toward Russia, and it also will mean a lot for what happens to Navalny. President Biden, who has been very firm in his statements, also needs now to follow up and act accordingly.
Okay, thank you, Anders. Very impressive suggestions. Okay, Vlad Kara Murza, what's your reaction to Anders' ideas?
I think that's absolutely spot on. Target the money. That's the most important thing that needs to be done. You know, it's been said that the largest export from Putin's regime to the West, it's not oil, it's not gas, it is corruption. And I absolutely agree with that assessment, but that of course is a two-way street, because for someone to be able to export corruption somewhere, someone else needs to be willing to import it. And for years and years, we have seen no shortage of Western governments, Western countries, Western banks, Western financial institutions who are all too willing to accept this, this dark money that is being looted from the people of Russia and then stashed away and hidden away and spent in Western jurisdictions. As Vladimir Milov said a few moments ago, it's only for us Russians to change the situation in our country. Contrary to what the Kremlin propaganda is saying, we're not asking foreigners to support us. We're not asking foreigners for money or for political help or for regime change or whatever other nonsense they come up with. The only thing we are actually asking the West to do is to stay true to its values and to stop enabling and to stop being complicit in the corruption and kleptocracy and human rights abuses of the Putin regime. I think the list that Alexei Navalny put out through his team after he was arrested, Vladimir Shurkov published that list, is a very good starting point. It's by no means expansive. It's only 8 names. I mean, there are many more that we could discuss, but it's a very important starting point. And most importantly, it nails down the most important principle that, it's not only some low-ranking officials who should be targeted. I mean, they should be as well. That's not an either-or question. But the most important people who should be targeted are those Kremlin wallets who enable this corruption and kleptocracy and human rights abuses and repression to continue with Western complicity, with Western enabling. That enabling should stop. And then, of course, another area for discussion is the vast amounts of illicit funds that are stashed away in Western jurisdictions. Anders had a piece in the Washington Post, I believe, a couple of years ago on this very issue. There are, by various estimates, there are between 800 billion and 1.3 trillion US dollars in private Russian assets hidden away in US and allied jurisdictions. Much of this wealth is linked to Vladimir Putin personally. We saw a very small glimpse of that a few years ago in the Panama Papers. You all remember that $2 billion offshore account belonging to a cellist from St. Petersburg, because nobody's ever heard of. People were joking back then, but that we all thought that Sir Paul McCartney was supposed to be the richest musician in the world now. Apparently it's some guy called Sergei Roldugin, because he's one of the people in whose name Putin stashes away his money. There are many Roldugins like this, and most of this money is in the West. It's high time to start going after that money. And there are precedents for this. When Western governments froze the assets belonging to dictators or corrupt leaders, like Bakiyev in Kyrgyzstan, like Gaddafi in Libya, and many others, to then later return that money to its rightful owner, the national treasury, the citizens of those countries, once those countries had a democratically elected government. That's exactly the same thing that should happen in Russia. Go after the money, stop the complicity, stop the enabling. That's the only thing we ask of the West. Everything we need to do in Russia, we're going to do ourselves.
Thank you. Vladimir Milov, would you like to comment on this as well?
Yes, sure. And I think it's important. We also coming back to the point of how Russians view the West and whether Kremlin's efforts to portray Navalny and the opposition as Western agents will be successful. I think you should understand one important thing, that Russian oligarchs and this, constant permanent siphoning of Russian profits, which are kept abroad and do not serve the benefit of the country, this is universally hated across the society. So one of the questions that I heard most frequently from ordinary Russians, thousands who are contacting me these days in connection with the recent events, they are asking when finally the West will stop enabling that, when Russian oligarchs will be kicked out. That's a very important thing for you to understand. There is a very strong demand inside Russia for the Western governments so that they stop acting as a shield to this Putin's enablers, welcoming and harboring this dirty Russian money, allowing them to buy property, real estate, corrupt business community and politicians, which is also a very important erosive factor to your own democracy. So I think if the West will start to finally act on stopping Putin's enablers, finding themselves a safe haven in the West, I think this will be a very greatly welcomed inside Russia, because these people, again, I will repeat, they're universally reviled here. Their reputation is net negative, and it's also very good that Alexei Navalny had actually exposed their connection with Putin in his last movie about the palace, because the scheme works like that. As Vladimir Kara Murza said, Putin has a lot of his own hand on this money, which are thought to be private. He can always say, come on, bring me several more billions because I want to build a winery or an oyster farm, whatever. So essentially our vertical of power works that way. So it's his money to a large extent, which was brilliantly exposed in this film. And now more and more Russians are aware of it. So I think it will be welcomed by, I'd say, a majority of the Russian population if Russian oligarchs and their dirty money will be kicked out of the West and will have no place anymore there.
Thank you. I'll ask Maria the last question before we turn to audience questions. Maria, Navalny has been criticized for supporting Moscow's seizure of Crimea. And in fact, a prominent Ukrainian politician told me just the other day that he's simply another Russian imperialist. And he's also been criticized for saying hostile things about people from the Caucasus and Central Asia in Russia. Some claim his position on these issues is evolving. What can you respond about this? What can you say about this?
Thank you, John. I think it's an important question since I see it coming up repeatedly among my Ukrainian friends, for example. So first of all, I want to mention that I very much empathize, with the Ukrainian struggle against Russia's imperialism, and I totally understand how sensitive and important the issue is to them. But at the same time, I just wanted to draw your attention at the polls again, right? The annexation of Crimea, despite the declining support for Putin, remains one of the most salient issues in Russia's politics today. There is still 86% of Russians as of 2019 who supported this annexation, its annexation to Russia, and this number has not really changed at all since 2014, if you look at the polls. Now, do you expect Navalny, a democratic politician who also struggling to gather mass following in Russia in very hostile conditions, do you expect in the issue that remains so salient for many Russians just to say, hey, we should just give it back, right? It doesn't matter what he thinks, and I'm actually quite sure that Alexei has himself quite a different perspective on the issue, but he cannot publicly possibly say something that goes against the interest of majority of the population, and I would not expect him to do that. I think Navalny has already demonstrated his absolute courage and his commitment, and I think there's just so much that we can ask from one person, particularly, as I said, that this is someone we certainly would like to have in power as compared to Putin. Right, so I wanted to draw this attention. This is not something you can really demand from a democratic politician in Russia today to say. Now, it's pretty certain, given Navalny's other statements and his policies and his connection with politicians abroad, that he will probably not follow a lot of Putin's policies, including Putin's imperialism towards neighboring countries. But as I said, I think it's a little bit too much to ask from him in current political environment and given his struggle for support in Russia. Second point about Navalny's nationalism and his some controversial statements he made in the past. First of all, we all make mistakes. I personally am afraid to remember, embarrassed to remember some things I posted in the past, and I think Navalny has apologized for his controversial statements, and this should be let go. The call to introduce the visas with some of the neighboring countries, I don't think that can be constructed as xenophobic or chauvinist per se also. But most importantly, I think it's very often misunderstood how the concept of nationalism is approached in the post-communist, post-Soviet space. If you look, for example, if you read the recent book by Holmes and Krastev that just came out last year, in post-communist societies, the concept of nationalism was not necessarily a bad thing. It was not necessarily constructed as Nazism or a decision, to damage a particular ethnic group. It was, for many of the societies, part of the liberalizing movements as an idea to reject the oppressive political structures which were imposed on them by the communist authorities, and to build their own statehood, their own nationhood. I think that Navalny actually, in this sense, follows on this idea of democratizing, liberalizing national movements that we observed in 1990s throughout all of the post-communist space, and that commonly also is a driver in contemporary post-Soviet countries like Ukraine or even Belarus, for that matter. So once again, I think in this sense, we shouldn't be thinking of his statement in the context of nationalism with a negative sign, as is often nationalism is viewed in Western Europe because of the painful experience of Germany, of course, but it should be thought more within the tradition of post-communist liberalizing regimes, where this is just an idea that citizens should restore control over their own nationhood that was taken away from them by the Kremlin crooks and cronies. So once again, when judging certain statements, certain policies, I don't think we should be thinking of it in terms of some fixed construct, but they need to be put in a specific context in a particular country in a given time period.
All right, thank you. Okay, we'll turn to our audience questions. We have a question from David Stulik, the head of the Eastern European program at the European Values Center for Security Policy. It's to Vladimir Milov. He says, I would be a bit careful to speak about US-EU unity approaching Putin's Russia. As you know, EU HRVP Borrell will visit Moscow in early February, and he speaks about the EU's strategic autonomy, meaning that the EU could deal with such countries like Russia and China on its own without agreeing on a transatlantic position with the US. So his question to Vlad is, how do you assess these attempts by some EU officials to pursue a policy towards Russia apart from the United States?
Now, listen, I think we've heard many different commentators taking awards of different European politicians out of context frequently. This goes back, Ambassador Herbst, this goes back to the question of Navalny's remarks on Crimea and on Georgia and Caucasus. A lot of them, I would say 95% of what is being attributed to Navalny is significantly taken out of context. So I think are these remarks by Mr. Borrell. Plus, I also have to say that I do work with European politicians a lot, and their recent drive towards a strategic autonomy from the United States had a reason in the past 4 years, so it can be understood to a large extent because of a totally different U-turn in the US policy away from the transatlantic partnership that was developing since World War II. Now, listen, we are right now in a dialogue with many European politicians. I also understand that they have to be pretty careful because Europe has a lot of economic ties with Russia. A lot of Europeans' jobs and well-being is dependent on economic ties with Russia. They cannot really ignore that. We perfectly understand that. But there is also a very strong momentum building in Europe where people will have to say enough is enough. We saw that in a recent resolution adopted by the European Parliament, which unanimously condemned Putin's actions against Alexei Navalny and basically called a very strong and a very specific action. And this resolution was supported by 5 major parliamentary groups of the European Parliament: European People's Party, Social Democrats, Liberals, Greens, Conservatives. They all form both the current European Commission and all these major European Union governance organs, plus they also form majority of the national governments. So the position of these 5 pan-European parties is very clear. I think, and I hope, and we're engaged in dialogue with our European colleagues, that the leaders of the European Union and the national governments would simply follow these guidelines, which were very strong, very clear, and very timely. So I advise to look at that as the European Parliament resolution as a plan of action, and do not try to take some tactical comments or tactical maneuvering out of the global context.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. If Navalny is taken out of the equation by a long prison sentence, will the Russian opposition be left in tatters and not a serious challenge to the Kremlin elite? I'll ask Vladimir Kara Murza first, and maybe Vlad wants Milov after that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, we've just heard about some of the recent and very marked trends in public opinion in Russia that Maria Snegovaya was describing. You know, it's not about any one individual. Alexei Navalny has been brilliantly effective in organizing the movement and in reaching out, especially to the young generation, with his social media outreach and other ways of he's been able to campaign. But it's not about, it's much more than any one person. It's beyond, you know, those are very clear shifts in public opinion that are, in my view, unstoppable. And so the answer to that question is no, it's not going to stop that movement. And if anything, in fact, you know, if we look at history, I think one of the biggest mistakes that many authoritarian regimes make is to actually turn the main opponents into sort of national symbols by imprisoning them. And if the Kremlin thinks that they're going to somehow diminish Alexei's voice or reduce his appeal or reduce the effectiveness of his campaign, for example, his campaign of tactical voting aimed at the parliamentary election this September, that's one of the things he's been most effective at in the past couple of years. The idea is that even or when the regime removes genuine opposition candidates from the ballot, which it does in most cases, the Navalny movement has been organizing people essentially to go and vote for, you know, literally nobody's, just some technical spoilers and political no-names who happen to be on the ballot, to send pro-regime candidates to humiliating defeats. We've seen this in Moscow in 2019. We've seen this in the whole series of regions in Russia in the local elections this last fall. The focus for the movement, if I understand it correctly now, is on the September 19th parliamentary election. If the Kremlin thinks that they're going to somehow reduce Navalny's voice or his appeal by putting him in prison, I think the result will be exactly the opposite. And, you know, again, I'm a historian by education, so when I put that hat on, I think history shows us definitively that many dictatorships eventually fall not under the power of their opponents even so much as under the weight of their own mistakes. And I think what the Kremlin is doing with Alexei Navalny today might end up being one of its biggest mistakes in the long run.
Okay, thank you. Vlad Milov. Sylvia Lynch raises a question similar, the other side of the earlier question. She asks, given Putin's control of the Kremlin, the intelligence agencies, as well as the oligarchs, Do you think Navalny or other future opposition leaders stand an actual chance of changing Russian leadership?
Yes, I think so, because you cannot run as illegitimate dictatorship as Putin's is forever. That's pretty clear. So I think the key issue, contrary to what many commentators are saying, is not what Navalny is doing or where he is now, for how long he will be imprisoned. That's going back to Vladimir's comments here. That's Putin's thinking. That is that the opposition is sort of a vertical of power. You know, you imprison a leader and everything is gone. Or how effective Navalny and his movement will be in taking on all this army of Siloviki, all these trillions of oligarchic money and so on. I think central here is legitimacy. Yes, Putin possesses a lot of tactical tools to cling on to power while losing legitimacy at the same time. But looking forward, there is no mechanism for him to actually keep in power indefinitely once the legitimacy is completely lost. In which regard, both the parliamentary elections of this year and the presidential election of 2024, whenever it happens, presents a very, very significant challenge because public support has been completely eroded. And I think that's the key factor here. Repressions only, revitalize and invigorate negativity in public, because when they see that somebody is being repressed for just saying the truth, that does not play too well into Putin's hands. That further erodes his support. And on the survival of the opposition movement with Navalny being imprisoned, listen, we are under a very serious attack right now. And I will not embark on a rant that, we are just a horizontal leaderless movement who is immune to this. No, we are not immune. This is serious damage, which Putin is doing right now to the movement. But we are also already well experienced. We have passed through similar situations before during a crackdown in 2019 during a Moscow protest. We were forced to effectively operate without Navalny when he was in coma after being poisoned. I think we have a very good movement full of bright and talented people with a strong division of labor. Each of us knows what to do and which front of activity to take. So it will be difficult, but we will survive. And the main factor here is that Putin is at war not with us. He is at war with the people of the Russian Federation. And we only act as an agents of change here. But if we are all imprisoned, there will be others. So there is no way for Putin to hold on to power once he's turned himself totally against his own country.
Our conversation we've talked about Belarus as a point of reference several times. Several questioners have also asked about the Belarus scenarios. So we have questions like, can we expect demonstrations to continue despite the police crackdown? In Belarus, obviously the crackdown has not succeeded. So let me ask Maria first, and then I give you, Vlad, a chance to respond. So Maria, what do you think about that?
I think it's a very important comparison to make with Belarus. I think it's one of the biggest inspirations and comparative frames that Russians so essentially compare themselves against at this point is Belarus. And there's certainly a lot of learning ongoing on the sides of both the authorities and the opposition movement as well. I do not think at this point Russia is, in terms of its popular kind of moods, is entirely close to Belarus. As in Russia, we actually observe polarization within the society with growing number of Russians, many of them younger groups, as we have discussed. Many of them feeling alienated from the regime and certainly becoming much more positionally minded. But this process has not overtaken all of the society yet. Belarus, in this sense, is several steps ahead of Russia, I believe, and of course the repressiveness of the dictatorship is also worse in that country. So from this perspective, I think Russia is on its way becoming Belarus, and not just me, a lot of people have mentioned that. I do not think in terms of poll, Russia is there yet. But also very importantly, we see that the Kremlin learns quite a lot from what Lukashenko is doing. So there is an interesting combination where it seems, at least judging by January 23rd, and certainly next consequent events may prove me wrong, but it seems that the Kremlin has decided to use the strategy of divide and conquer, where the opposition certainly is the opposition leadership is prosecuting very brutally, but there is no such a dramatic crackdown on the protesters yet, as we observed in Belarus, probably because that following Ukraine's Euromaidan experience and also Belarusian experience in August 2020, probably the Kremlin is afraid to provoke larger groups of Russians into the streets if it starts massively beating up the protesters. I'm sorry, I just want to mention that it certainly happens. There is a lot of crackdown ongoing, but it's not as brutal yet as we observe something that we've seen in Belarus. So I think, just to sum it up, both sides are learning, and the Russia, unfortunately, or maybe for better or worse, is not where Belarus is at this point, but it's certainly heading in that direction.
Okay, thank you. Vlad, you want to say something? Milov?
Yeah, I think we're certainly heading towards the Belarus direction, but there are very important differences because Putin was never, despite his desire, he was never able to completely shut down Russian institutions, as did Lukashenko many years ago. So we still have, although we are a brutal autocratic regime, we still have a lot of institutions in place. And there are many, many regions like Ural, Siberia, Far East, where we had a relatively fair vote count. And United Russia Party lost many times there. You saw that, right? So there are limits to what Putin can do. Lukashenko for a long time has built like a totally repressive regime with no institutions at all. That's different in Russia. And a brutal Lukashenko-style crackdown would only continue to undermine Putin's legitimacy. So I think to me, best tactic is not to repeat what the people of Belarus have done, like coming out every week, but focus more on the upcoming parliamentary elections, where we won't have this simple Putin versus Navalny formula, but Putin's legitimacy and United Russia parliamentary majority legitimacy will be seriously put in question nationwide. That will bring in more people that would want to just participate in protests related to Navalny. So I think we need to do that. It will be a bit wiser strategy than just coming out every week. Let's see how it goes.
Okay, Vlad Kara Murza, do you want to jump in here as well?
Well, of course, Lukashenko has about 5.5 year head start on Putin, right? He came to power earlier. He began to do the things he began to do earlier. In fact, when Putin came in and started doing many of the same things, going after the media, going after the opposition, imprisoning and killing his opponents, rigging elections, and so on and so forth. The late Boris Nemtsov called it the Lukashization of Russia. That was the term because many of the things were so similar. And so for Putin to watch the protests that have been going on in Belarus since last August has been really frightening, not only because of the prospect of losing, a reliable ally and for some sort of geopolitical considerations, but in fact, because for him, that is a glimpse into his own possible future in the year 2024, because many of the processes in our two countries, the last two dictatorships in Europe are so very similar in so many ways. And Vladimir Milov mentioned the year 2024. I think that's going to be a crucial year. That is, of course, the year when our next quote unquote presidential election is supposed to be held. And I think there are many factors that could contribute to a very important and very eventful year, mostly, of course, so on the domestic scene. In Russia, I think Putin was right to fear that what happened in Belarus in 2020 would be his own future in 2024. I also think there's a very important role for the international community because, as you know, and as all of our viewers today know, this is supposed to be Putin's final constitutional mandate, right? It's supposed to run out on May the 7th, 2024. Last summer, under the cover of this pandemic, Putin rammed through a series of constitutional amendments, the most important of which allowed himself personally, not abolish the presidential term limits, but allowed himself personally to waive, to ignore, to violate the presidential term limits. Now, those constitutional amendments were enacted illegally and illegitimately. In fact, as is very clearly stated in the recent European Parliament resolution on the matter, there were several ways in which Russian legislative procedures were violated in bringing about those constitutional amendments. Most importantly, the plebiscite itself was a total sham with no campaigning allowed, no oversight of the vote count, no international or independent domestic observers allowed. It had nothing to do with any sort of legitimate procedures even close. And so that waiver, that permission for Putin, the permission Putin gave himself to violate presidential term limits, is legally speaking null and void. So I think it would be very important to see a clear and principled stance from the international community in terms of non-recognition of any attempt by Putin to illegally hold on to power past May the 7th, 2024, the same kind of non-recognition we saw from both sides of the Atlantic with regard to Lukashenko.
Well, Vlad, thank you. That's a very provocative, but I think insightful analysis. Our time is up. We're already past the witching hour. I'd like to thank our panelists for a very interesting discussion. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in, and I'd thank our staff for making this event possible.